One. Hello, I'm Mario Toneguzzi, taking care of business on Canada's podcast network. My guest today is Don Kottick, who is president and CEO of Sotheby's International Realty Canada. Thanks again for joining us, Don.
Oh, Mario, great to see you again. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's talk about Sotheby's latest top-tier real estate report. Tell me what's happening in the luxury real estate market across the country.
Okay, well, I think it's important that we put everything of what really can be best summarized as an anomaly. So, I think the market, the buyers and the sellers, are really behaving as we expected, especially after we've had a number of rate increases, which kind of shocked us. So what we're seeing really is a reaction of coming off that pent up market. And then with the rate increases, you have to take into account what is happening within Canada, where obviously the cost of living and the inflation is increasing dramatically. We still have lots of federal spending at this point in time, which will hopefully be curtailed. And then we also have the volatile financial markets. And then we have the Bank of Canada, which has had a number of rate increases. And there's talking about another rate increase at the end of October, and then potentially, even rate increases into 2023. So I think really what it's done, it's created a lot of uncertainty in the market. But the reality is we still have a lot of pent up demand, right across the country. And that's kind of where we find ourselves at this point in time.
Mm-hmm. What's the inventory like out there for the market in this sort of the top end?
Well, when we were looking at Q3, the inventory had pretty much evaporated. And now what we're starting to see in different markets, we're starting to see some of the inventory starting to grow. In some of the major markets, in some of the downtown core, especially in some of the premium neighborhoods, we're still seeing a shortage of inventory. But in some of the peripheral areas, especially the areas that saw a lot of appreciation, during the last 2 years of the pandemic, we're starting to see some transition happening, and some of the inventory is starting to grow in some of those areas.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you look across the country, Don, what markets are continuing to do well when it comes to luxury homes?
Well, I think, Mario, your hometown and province of Alberta is probably one of the outliers right now. It's interesting that we're seeing strong local and economic confidence. And obviously, we're seeing some economic diversification in Alberta at this point in time. We're seeing migration specifically from Ontario, primarily, but also from BC, coming to Alberta. And as a result of that, it's kind of leading the market right now, in terms of position to other major markets in Canada.
Well, it's an interesting point you bring up there, Don, because actually I've been doing a lot of work recently on looking at the fact that how many people from Ontario and BC are coming to Alberta. House prices in Calgary are half of what they are in Toronto and Vancouver. Even more, even more than half lower in Edmonton than those two markets. When you look at what's happening, do you continue to see that trend happening, the people moving to Alberta for the affordability?
I think, right now, it appears that trend is probably going to, continue for the foreseeable future. And, in terms of affordable markets, really, Montreal and Calgary are leading the way. And, I guess there's a really great, standard of living, a high standard of living. You couple that with the lower cost of living. I think Alberta will continue to be a destination for the foreseeable future.
And I guess a $1 million home in Edmonton and in Calgary gives you much, much more than you would get in Toronto or Vancouver, would it not?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, it's you definitely get a lot of value in Alberta relative to the other areas. With the exception in Quebec, there's some comparable affordability, but I still think Calgary is kind of leading the way in terms of that marketplace.
When you look at the market across the country in the coming months, for the rest of this year and into next year, what are you expecting?
Well, it's really interesting. What obviously we have to wait for the consumers to absorb the rate increases. I think that there has definitely been a transition that's happened coming off. The last 2 years of the pandemic. People are going to want to see how many times the Bank of Canada is going to continue to raise the rates. But at the very core and the fundamentals of the Canadian marketplace, we have a chronic shortage of housing relative to our population,
Yeah.
and the government is still promoting immigration. Even though they've brought in a bit of a foreign buyer ban, they are still promoting immigrants to come to Canada. So typically, 60% of the immigrants that come through these um, you know uh, programs are in the home buying class. So we are going to see them put additional pressure on the housing market. We still have pent up demand, regardless of what happens. We have people, buyers and sellers, that might be waiting to see what's happened. People are going to have to trade and sell for life reasons and for personal reasons. So the market is going to continue. I think long term, fundamentally, because we have this chronic undersupply of of properties across the country. We have this pent up demand. Even if rates do creep up, at some point, people are going to say, well, this is the market, and they're going to have to jump back in.
Yeah.
So, from a long term perspective, I think the housing market, is going to, bounce back at some point. It's just a question of when that happens. You can never time the bottom of any market. And so, at some point, once people are used to kind of the shock of absorbing these rate increases, the market should pick up again.
All right, super. Thanks, Don, for joining us today.
My pleasure, Mario. Always great to talk to you, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
All right, that was Don Kottick, who is president and CEO of Sotheby's International Realty Canada. I'm Mario Toneguzzi, taking care of business on Canada's podcast network. Thanks for joining us today.